Well, at least for one night, the Memphis Grizzlies won a battle in their current war with adversity. They fought, scratched, clawed, played pretty solid defense against one of the NBA's best scoring offenses, and they found a way to win when they desperately needed it. Their stars played like stars. Their Dillon Brooks did not play that way, and they showed some signs of the things that they need to get better at potentially from the outside heading into the trade deadline. We're going to talk about all that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Lock in with me.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another installment, another episode, another journey, if you will, of Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network here at Locked On Grizzlies. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by LinkedIn. Today's episode, brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. Rate, review, subscribe, like, comment wherever you get podcasts, as well as over on YouTube. It is much appreciated as we enter the trade deadline here with the Memphis Grizzlies. Lots of fascinating things to play out. Make sure you're subscribed. Notifications are on, ready for the next episode to drop, as DeMichael Cole, my co-host, and I take you through this Memphis Grizzlies season. And you might notice, if you've been listening to the show, I do believe we talked about how DeMichael was going to be doing this show solo. Life happens sometimes, dear listener, dear viewer, and DeMichael not able to be with us on this show. So when a teammate needs it, you step up. I'm a big believer in that. And DeMichael has been very good to me, very handsome, very smart, very suave, as we've talked about numerous times, and I make sure he knows it. Thinking of him as he, gets some stuff straight. And I'm happy to fill in on this episode to talk about a Grizzlies win. We don't get many of those around these parts of late. And I do think that the first thing that you lead off with when it comes to what Memphis was able to do against the Chicago Bulls is not an individual performance, but a performance of the team. And I want to give a shout out to the defensive focus of the Memphis Grizzlies, because what needs to be understood, okay, obviously Chicago is struggling. They played in San Antonio on the first night of their back-to-back, but they scored 130 plus points against the San Antonio Spurs. And I know the Spurs are bad, and I know the Spurs are not actively trying to win, but to hang 130 plus on somebody that's an NBA opponent is still pretty impressive. It was a blowout, so these Bulls did not log their normal assortment of minutes. Going into this game, that made me a little nervous. If you paid attention in our last episode of Locked On Grizzlies, I thought that maybe the Bulls would be a little well rested. They would find their legs and they would compete. That happened in the third quarter. It did not happen in the first half, thankfully. Memphis was able to build a lead through that process. But in the third quarter, the Bulls fought back. And if you have been paying attention to these Grizzlies, it's been fourth quarter collapses that have kind of been the issue for them of late. This time it was a third quarter collapse. So Memphis was up 12 at the end of the first quarter. They were up 10 at halftime. And the Bulls only scored 14 points in the first quarter. So maybe they had some jet lag coming over from San Antonio. Second half starts, and the Grizzlies, who are one of the best third quarter teams in the entire NBA, especially when it comes to scoring, they get outscored by the Bulls 13 points, 36-23 in the third quarter of this game. So Memphis had a lead and lost it. And given how badly things have been going for the Memphis Grizzlies, very easily, this young team could have hung their heads and said, oh, heck, here we go again, and decided that tonight just wasn't their night and continued the snowball effect. But again, to their credit of Ja Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., to a lesser extent, Dillon Brooks. We'll talk more about that. Desmond Bane, Brandon Clark had some really strong fourth quarter minutes for this team. Another double-double for BC. Impressive showings from multiple players to get this team across the finish line. Again, to hold the Chicago Bulls, one of the best offenses in the NBA. They didn't have DeMar DeRozan. That obviously is an important piece. But 89 points in this era of the NBA is pretty impressive. And it was done in large part because of the play of one Jaren Jackson Jr. 5 blocks again, 2 steals, 7 stocks. He was 9 for 13 from the floor, hit 40% of his threes, 24 points. You would have liked to see that rebound number a little bit higher. Morant and Bane both out rebounding Jaren is not ideal. But you have Jaren Jackson Jr. in position to be a Defensive Player of the Year candidate. He showed that wide eyes open against the Chicago Bulls. If you had questions about whether or not Jaren deserves that recognition of being in the All-Star game, the game against Chicago should clear your judgment a little bit. Jaren Jackson Jr. is a star, and he is worthy of that selection that he earned to the Western Conference All-Star team. Sorry he's not Anthony Davis. Sorry he's not Anthony Edwards. His name may not be Ant, but he looked like a superhero in terms of like Ant-Man going up against the Bulls. He just had a massive game. And Ja Morant, the much maligned Ja Morant. He's been in the news for a variety of reasons that aren't the most positive. He's got me and DeMichael saying that the Grizzlies need to grow up, and I stand by those things. One win does not change the overall perspective and complexion of the state of mind that is the Memphis Grizzlies. I think some mistakes have been made over the last several weeks, and they can be better in a variety of ways that are all within their control. And that's the best news about this, dear listener, dear viewer. That's the best thing. This is stuff that is within their control. They can make choices to try to improve these issues. And Ja Morant, at least on the floor, took a strong step towards reminding people of what makes him a special talent. 34 points, 7 assists, 6 rebounds on 20 shots. Really a strong outing for Ja. And a lot of the numbers he put up, I believe it was 13 or so points, were in that third quarter when it could have gotten a lot uglier, where Chicago could have pulled away and, again, put the foot on the throat, finished it a little bit more aggressively. The tone of this episode of Locked On Grizzlies sounds a little bit different if Morant isn't there in that third quarter to help Memphis limp along and stay within striking distance. The fourth quarter, they destroyed the Chicago Bulls. This game was bookended by excellent defensive quarters. 14 points in the first quarter for Chicago, 14 in the fourth. And you can write off one 14-point quarter as just poor shooting, right? We talked about them being on the second night of a back-to-back. Maybe they're tired. They had poor travel. They didn't sleep well in the hotel. Whatever the case might be, one 14-point quarter, maybe you just push to the side. But two, Memphis defended well, and they deserve credit for the defense that they played. They deserve credit for not laying down in an adverse situation where they very easily could have. They very easily could have. When it feels like the entire world is against you and you have that weight on you, that metaphorical weight, that can be a very difficult thing to deal with, especially when you're young. And I think we talk a lot about it, their youth, and we talk about how they're immature because of that to an extent. But imagine where you were when you were 23, if you are of an older age like me. And think about making poor decisions sometimes. Think about doing things that maybe you would eventually regret. Think about, things that you said to someone or actions that you did. There's stuff that I'd like to have back. I don't know about you. These guys are on the world stage, professional basketball. And the Memphis Grizzlies, you can't ask for national media coverage, and then when things are going poorly, say, oh, no, never mind. We don't want that kind of coverage. That's not how this works. The Grizzlies are on the stage now. They are in the arena, so to speak. They are a team that is expected to be a marquee name in the NBA, largely because of their superstar, Ja Morant, who was recently in the news because of accusations that members of his entourage, his group of friends, whatever phrasing you want to use, people associated with him, allegedly, may have pointed a weapon with a laser at members of the Indiana Pacers. That's an allegation that wasn't proven by the NBA, and Ja Morant continues to deny it. And again, confrontation happened, and that should be enough in terms of we have to direct this energy in a different way. I think Morant did an excellent job of that on Tuesday night. Jaren Jackson Jr. continues to grind away. The Grizzlies found a way to win, again, in an adverse situation, not ideal in any way, shape, or form in terms of a full 48-minute game. But at this stage, when you're in this the muck and the mire, you'll take the wins where you can get them. So kudos to Ja Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., the Grizzlies team on a hard-fought win. Again, you beat a lottery team more than likely, a team that probably will be sellers at the trade deadline. Maybe they'll be sellers to you. I'm sure we'll talk about that more in tomorrow's episode. But you have to understand that when you are struggling, and you could see it in the faces of the players, that win meant something to them. Maybe it meant more than it should have for a team that's supposedly a title contender, but that meant a lot on Tuesday night, and good on them. It's good to get that proverbial monkey off your back to an extent. We're going to talk about a player on the Grizzlies who has become quite polarizing, who maybe, if it was his last game in Memphis, really drove that point home against the Chicago Bulls. But before we get to that, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. As a small business owner or hiring manager, you know that success in 2023 depends on the team members that you surround yourself with. You have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. With LinkedIn Jobs, you hire qualified candidates more efficiently by matching your roles with people that have the skills, values, and experiences to help you achieve your goals. They help you quickly attract qualified candidates to your open jobs with targeting tools over at LinkedIn Jobs. They identify the most qualified candidates, connect you with them at a fast rate and for free. LinkedIn Jobs makes it easy to screen and rate applicants based on job qualifications. It is why small businesses rank LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Dillon Brooks, was that the last game he ever plays as a member of the Memphis Grizzlies? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, flying solo, mentioned at the top of this episode to Michael, handling some business on his end. Everything's fine. He's going to be all right. But sometimes there's other places you need to be. I'm happy to step in and fly solo post Grizzlies Bulls. In the first segment, we mentioned the success of the team in this particular instance, finding a way to overcome adversity. Somebody that offensively did not help with that process, if we're being honest, is Dillon Brooks. And Dillon Brooks really has become a lightning rod among Grizzlies fans. He's always been polarizing. He's always had supporters and detractors. And I, very publicly, have argued for Dillon Brooks, saying that he should sign a 4-year, $80 million contract extension, talk about how he's the heart and soul of the team. I still think that last part is true. I do believe that he has a major role in terms of what the culture of the Memphis Grizzlies is. But I think that when you struggle the way that Dillon is struggling, and you do things like hit Donovan Mitchell in the nuts, essentially, that's not cool, right? So you're running out of things to argue for the guy over. You're running out of reasons to look at him in a way that he needs to be a part of this thing moving forward. And in terms of tradable assets, Dillon Brooks is an expiring contract. Dillon Brooks makes $11 million this season. In terms of cap contract matching salary trades, you can get things done without Dillon Brooks involved. It's easier to get things done with Dillon Brooks involved. So we'll talk more about the trade deadline in the next segment and throughout the next episode or two leading into our game Friday for the Grizzlies against the Timberwolves. But if that was Dillon Brooks' last game as a member of the Memphis Grizzlies, he did not go out like a lion. He very much, offensively at least, went out like a lamb. 2 for 12 from the field, 1 for 6 from beyond the arc, 4 assists, which is pretty strong for Dillon, right? That's an area that people complain about, him not necessarily being selfish, but not taking care of the ball, not making the extra pass. 4 assists for Dillon, so he deserves some credit for that. 2 steals, and he was a plus 10. He logs a lot of his minutes with the starters. Maybe that's why you argue he's a plus 10. But the one thing I do want to point out, on top of his offensive struggles, and those are very real. If you look at his numbers, it's not just this game. He is currently in the coldest shooting stretch of his career since this year began, folks. Since this year began, he has shot from the field better or right at 40% 5 times in 2023. They have played something like 14 games, 15 games, and obviously Dillon hasn't played in all of them. But he is ice cold offensively right now. There's no two ways about it. It's hard to argue for him in a positive manner because of those struggles. But when you watch him play defense, and in that fourth quarter where the defense was so key to the Grizzlies getting back in that game, he was the guy on Zach LaVine, the best offensive player that the Bulls had in this game. He was the guy that helps LaVine be limited offensively. LaVine had a massive game in terms of 24 points on 17 free throw attempts. He shot pretty poorly from the free throw line, 10 of 17. That might be another reason the Grizzlies won. But it was LaVine only taking 13 shots in 40 minutes. Guys that took more shots than Zach LaVine. Ayo Dosunmu, guard there for Chicago. Nikola Vucevic. Obviously, you would have liked some of those shots to be redistributed to LaVine, but in 40 minutes of play, kudos to Dillon for limiting his opportunities, getting in his face, making them pass the ball out, and finding other guys that would have to beat them. That matters. And Dillon remains that defensive force. Somebody on Twitter called Dillon Brooks the Reggie Evans of the perimeter for the Memphis Grizzlies. And if you don't know who Reggie Evans is, he was an extremely frustrating member of the Los Angeles Clippers during the grit and grind era when it was Lob City versus grit and grind. And Evans was a instigator. Evans was a physical presence. He was a great rebounder. And he really excelled at annoying the Memphis Grizzlies and other teams. But obviously the Clippers and the Grizzlies were major rivals during this time period, about 10 years ago now, which is crazy to say out loud. I don't know that that's a perfect comp. I think Dillon is a better offensive player than Reggie Evans ever was. But right now, I think it's fair in terms of Dillon being limited, not seeing the ball go through the hoop. And all that leads us to what happens on Thursday during the trade deadline. Obviously, we still have a ways to go, but it's important to point out that the Memphis Grizzlies don't play again until after the trade deadline. Memphis is off on Wednesday. They're off Thursday. You'd imagine there'll be a practice in there somewhere. And then they play Friday against Minnesota. Dillon Brooks may have realistically played his last game as a member of the Memphis Grizzlies. Offensively, it was abysmal. 2 for 12 is not something you can argue for. He airballed some shots. He took some poor shots. He just wasn't in rhythm on that end. He was forcing things. He had those 4 assists, which is signs of him continuing to try to evolve and develop, but still, too many shots. Those 12 attempts, they weren't helpful. He didn't help Memphis win on the offensive side of the floor. Defensively, he most certainly did. And if you disagree with that, I'll challenge you to watch the game. Watch how he plays defense. Watch how that energy filters. Jaren Jackson Jr. gets the highlights and the headlines, deservedly so, defensively. He is on a tear right now. There was a stretch during that Bulls game where Jaren looked like the best player on the planet. He's not. I'm not saying he is, but for about a 2-minute run, you're watching this guy play, and you would wonder if you had never watched basketball before, who's better than that dude? That's how good Jaren looked at times against Chicago. But Dillon has been a steadying force and a steady presence on that defensive side of the floor. He is impactful there. Does that negate his offensive issues? That's a question that you kind of have to answer for yourself. In terms of winning basketball, in terms of the team being better when he's on the floor than when he's off of it, I think it's pretty clear that he matters in that way. Doesn't mean that a trade wouldn't improve the offensive situation of Memphis. It doesn't mean that the Grizzlies wouldn't be in a better spot potentially if they had somebody else in that slot that was a comparable defender but a more efficient offensive player like an OG and an Obi. Maybe those folks are right. But Dillon Brooks has been a part of this franchise for 5 years now. And in those 5 years, he has been everything Memphis has needed him to be. He has been a starter. He has been a key player. He has defended the best guy for the opponent ever since his rookie season. I, personally, will be sad if that was indeed Dillon Brooks' last game. Is it possible? Yes. Can you make an argument it should have been? Yeah, I think you can for a variety of reasons. But Dillon made the Grizzlies better during his time. If he's gone, salute. If he's still here, he's going to continue to help the Memphis Grizzlies win games. Maybe just not in the way that you would prefer to see it done. The NBA trade deadline is approaching, and Locked On has you covered. Thursday, February 9th, tune in to Locked On NBA on YouTube at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to hear reaction from the trades that will change the rest of the NBA season. Who becomes contenders? Who is tanking for a better future? Subscribe to Locked On NBA on YouTube. Do not miss a deal. I'll be representing Locked On Grizzlies as part of that. If there is a trade, you'll see me on there. Make sure you're joining us. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to our wonderful partner, FanDuel Sportsbook. Highly suggest you check them out. We're really excited about our partnership with them here at Locked On because they're the number one sportsbook in America. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download FanDuel now so you can bet Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. The FanDuel Sports app is safe, secure, and easy to use. You can go and bet on the Chiefs. You can bet on the Eagles. You can bet Mahomes over yards. You can bet Jalen Hurts under touchdowns. Best of all, you get paid for your winnings instantly. Join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. What do the Memphis Grizzlies need at the trade deadline? We'll talk about that next here at Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax. The wonderful DeMichael Cole is elsewhere handling business. Happy to fill in for him and talk about this trade deadline that's approaching. Obviously, we'll have a full trade deadline preview for you on Thursday's show. But just as a bit of a preview to whet your appetite, to whet your whistle, so to speak, on trade deadline talk. Over at my Substack, which thank you if you are subscribed and you're listening to this, over 100 subscribers now, continuing to grow. Much appreciated from all those that are making Written in the Dark part of their Grizzlies experience, just like Locked On Grizzlies, I should say. Over there today, I have a piece live talking about what Memphis actually needs. Because you see people saying, you come up with a trade idea and, oh, well, we need a big. We don't need that. We need a big. Or another trade idea gets floated and it's for a big and people are like, whoa, we need perimeter defense. And then you go and acquire a perimeter defender and somebody says, are you mad? We need help in the half-court offense. So obviously the Grizzlies have multiple flaws. What team doesn't have flaws? What people don't have flaws? Am I right? How do you address those things at the trade deadline? You can't fix them all. So I would say prioritizing should be the main focus, the main goal of these next 48 hours if the Grizzlies make a trade. And for the record, I continue to say this. I think this has changed. Obviously, one win doesn't necessarily change it from Tuesday night. I believe that the way that the last few weeks have gone, the Grizzlies are more likely than ever to do something. I think if they were keeping the straight and narrow, they were 500 over the stretch instead of the terrible run of losing. I think that they just stand pat and they don't really make a trade because I believe that this front office, they don't act like a contender. They don't portray themselves that way. The players are playing their tails off. The coaches are coaching their tails off. They've overachieved every single season based off of their age and the way they're constructed. The front office is not changing their timeline for anybody. They see themselves as contenders, of course, but they want to be long-term contenders. They don't want to sacrifice future flexibility for the here and now. And there's logical explanations for that. It makes sense to an extent. But when you're playing as poorly as Memphis has the last several weeks, it gets harder and harder to argue for the status quo. So I think something will happen. Will I be surprised if nothing happens? Of course not, because that's literally since the Justice Winslow trade several years ago, the Memphis Grizzlies have done their business trade-wise at and around the NBA draft. And the NBA draft's not for several months yet. So I don't see Memphis suddenly changing their stripes and going all in at the trade deadline. But what are some things they need to address? First off, back up big. I'm not as big on this. I think that this is one that if you do a 2-for-1 or 3-for-2 trade to make some sort of deal, you can go in the buyout market. You can go in the G League. Kenneth Lofton Jr. is literally right there. Maybe you bring him in and they can be your emergency big. If you want a true big, Gorgui Dieng is out there available. I know there's lots of pieces that could potentially be had that can help with screening and rebounding as an emergency big. But you've got Steven Adams, eventually healthy. You've got Jaren Jackson Jr., Brandon Clark, Santi Aldama, who despite everybody's requests, not everybody's requests, some people's requests, not actually a 3, at least not yet. He hasn't done that consistently at any point in his career. And he once again was not a 3 going into the game on Tuesday. He only did that with the injuries and the suspensions that were impacting Memphis in that Sunday game. Bigs are important. I think Memphis has enough front court pieces that they don't need to worry so much about that. My priorities at the trade deadline, if the Grizzlies actually were to make a move, will be centered around two things. They need to improve in the half-court offense. That is a massive problem. And when you get to the playoffs, which is what my focus in terms of my improvements would be, you have to be able to score in the half court. If you can't do that consistently, you're not going to win a 7-game series against a good team, against a team that is also a contending team. The Memphis Grizzlies fancy themselves, at least the players and coaches, as a contender. In order to contend, you have to be able to score when the game slows down and you're in half-court sets and you're not able to get out and transition and run. DeMar DeRozan is a guy who has been floated. A sportsbook, sports betting, I believe it's called, had DeMar DeRozan at 3-1 odds to come to the Memphis Grizzlies. The only team with better odds to land DeMar DeRozan outside of the Bulls keeping him, of course, was the Los Angeles Lakers. And while DeMar DeRozan is flawed in terms of his three-point shooting, he only shoots 1.6 a game, I believe, not a part of his game really extensively at all. He is a top 30 player in the NBA, and he does it through not being a three-point shooter on the perimeter. So that tells you he's elite in the mid-range. That tells you he can create for himself. He's become better as a passer. He would help solve those half-court offensive issues immensely. But to counter that idea, he would be a guy that would be like an all-in deal. You're dealing multiple firsts. You're probably moving on from LaRavia or Zaire or David Roddy. You're probably shipping out a Dillon Brooks in that trade, maybe even a Tyus Jones to make money work. There are guys that are significant pieces of the rotation right now that if you want to acquire a DeMar DeRozan, it's going to take some capital. Obviously, there are ways to fudge that a little bit. If you want Alec Burks, who I know DeMichael's a big fan of out of Detroit, he can give you similar looks. He's a good shooter. He can create for himself off the dribble. Not as good as DeRozan, but you won't have to give up key pieces. There are guys that'll be floating out there to help with that half-court offense. And the other thing that I really want to see Memphis get better at is perimeter defense. Some of that is scheme. I think that's important to point out. Taylor Jenkins has a scheme that they prioritize funneling things into Jaren Jackson Jr. and Steven Adams when he's there. Sometimes that involves hedging or cutting, positioning your body as a perimeter defender in a certain way. You're going to leave open a shooter. That's part of what they do. But if you had a longer, bigger wing, like a Josh Richardson, or if you're going all in, OG Anunoby of the Toronto Raptors, those guys would be in a better position to close out on said shooters. So having guys in a position to make those shots more difficult and not allow teams that are able to hit those shots consistently, like most of the teams in the Western Conference playoff picture are able to do, that will make this team better. But again, OG Anunoby is cheaper than DeMar DeRozan, but you're still moving on from a Dillon Brooks. You're still moving on from somebody. Danny Green and Jake LaRavia is pretty much the bare minimum there in terms of significant pieces. And Danny Green could be a significant piece. Didn't quite look the part on Tuesday, but he has that experience. He has the physical ability to hit those shots. Can he get comfortable with his knee is the question. And that's one that we're kind of out of time answering, right? He only had a few games that he was able to play. The trade deadline is almost upon us, and Memphis doesn't play again until the deadline is passed. So no more evidence, no more data that can be collected. You got to make a decision. And I am intrigued by what Memphis is going to do in terms of defending the three, because I think that's where they're going to run into their biggest troubles in the postseason. So obviously you want to rebound better. You want to have a guy that can set strong screens for a player like Ja Morant. All those things make total sense. I am more concerned about half-court offense and defending the three. And my all-in trade that I suggested on Twitter, DeMar DeRozan and Alex Caruso for Tyus Jones and Dillon Brooks and Zaire Williams and a couple of firsts. That sounds like a lot. But again, DeMar DeRozan is a top 30 player in this league. And if you trot out a starting five of Morant, DeRozan, Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Steven Adams, now you have a half-court offense where you have someone other than Morant and Bane that can create for themselves. Now you have someone that can get their own shot and hit it consistently in that traditional small forward role. And with Caruso coming off the bench, he can play the point. He's under contract longer than Tyus Jones. His money makes a little more sense in terms of fitting in with a backup point guard. And to be honest with you, Tyus has been better as a starter this year than he has been as a reserve. He doesn't play particularly well next to Ja, especially defensively. Caruso checks a lot of those boxes. So for me, if I were going all in, DeMar DeRozan, Alex Caruso would be my two targets. They address the half-court offense, the perimeter defense, and we just saw Caruso play against the Grizzlies, of course. DeRozan sat out. Maybe he was looking for houses in Memphis. What do you think? Probably not. But I'm intrigued by what this trade deadline is going to be. They could go all in, bring in an Anunoby or a DeRozan potentially, or they could do nothing. There's arguments for both sides, and that uncertainty is what is going to lead to a pretty fun trade deadline moving forward. Thanks for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. Now go make your second listen game to game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. It will be the trade deadline the next time you're with us here on Locked On Grizzlies. Hopefully, DeMichael will return. He and I will talk trade deadline goodies, any intel he's been able to garner, any intel with my limited sources that I've been able to gather, any trades that were made the day before. Obviously, this show airing on Wednesday, so we'll talk about anything that might have happened on Wednesday. Maybe Memphis gets froggy and frisky the day before the deadline since they don't have any games between now and Thursday. Maybe they do their business a day early. It'll be interesting to watch play out. We'll be keeping an eye on Memphis, of course, specifically, but the entire NBA, and we'll talk about that on our next episode. Rate, review, subscribe, like, comment over on YouTube, as well as anywhere that you can get your podcasts. Thank you so much for making Locked On Grizzlies part of your Grizzlies experience, as well as your NBA content experience. It is much appreciated. I am thoroughly enjoying my time with Locked On. I have grown. I know DeMichael has grown. We have gotten better as a tandem. I think we're doing better solo as well. Hopefully you're enjoying the shows. Let us know in the comments how we are doing, things that are good, things that can be better. No shame in our game. We're trying to put on the best podcast that we possibly can about the Memphis Grizzlies, and hopefully you're enjoying what we're doing. So until the trade deadline, at least the day of the trade deadline, enjoy yourselves, stay safe, stay healthy, have a wonderful Wednesday. Until next time, I'm Joe Mullinax. Stay locked in, Grizzlies fans. This is Locked On Grizzlies.